Let's get started with Election Day results, of course, still coming in at this hour.
So here's where some of the key races stand right now. First and foremost, NBC News projects that Republican Glenn Youngkin will be the next governor of Virginia after upsetting Democrat Terry McAuliffe in a hard-fought contest. Youngkin winning in a state easily won by President Biden last year, shaking up the picture for both parties heading into next year's midterms. In New Jersey, the only other race for governor, that one remains too close to call, really close to call. New York City and Boston both have chosen their new mayors. We're covering it all this morning with NBC News correspondents Heidi Przybyla and Rahema Ellis, along with NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray. Let's start with Heidi. She joins us from Alexandria, Virginia. Heidi, good morning. So to many, the Virginia's governor's race was the big prize this election cycle. Former Governor Terry McAuliffe started out with a strong lead in this campaign, but that's not how it ended up. Glenn Youngkin narrowly edging him out. What do we know about the voter turnout, and how did that impact the outcome here?
Yeah, good morning, Joe. The Democrats' hypothesis really broke last night. The hypothesis was that if you just get a huge turnout in this state, which has more Biden voters, then Terry McAuliffe wins. Well, we had record-smashing turnout, and Glenn Youngkin won. And here's how he did it. He held Trump's margins in a lot of these rural Trump counties in the West and Southwest, but he also built on Trump's margins or cut into the Democrats' advantage in the suburbs, particularly Loudoun County, where you had a lot of those controversies over schools. There was also lower African-American turnout. So you combine all of those things, and that is how Youngkin pulled it out. So for all of the prognostications over the past 4 years, Joe, about this state really being more blue than purple, nah, it's still purple.
Heidi, Youngkin, a Republican, did not tie himself closely to former President Donald Trump. He struck this delicate balancing act with Trump. He didn't campaign with him, but he was still able to get Trump voters to turn out for him. He also ran on some key issues. Tell us about the campaign he ran and what issues made the difference here.
Well, look, it's always, if you look at the exit polls, the economy always is number one. So that's what we saw here in the end, the economy and jobs, maybe the sense that COVID was holding the economy back, inflation worries, higher gas prices. But here was the real issue that made the difference. And you talk to voters out on the street and in these polls, which is education. How did that happen? Well, first of all, a lot of these heated school board meetings that we saw all across the state had to do with COVID protocols and Republican parents feeling that maybe there was too much in the way of restrictions there. And then this issue that Glenn Youngkin really pushed, this notion that critical race theory is being taught in schools, even though it was hard to find specific examples of the curriculum that would have qualified as that in our discussions with voters. And then finally, there was a searing ad that Glenn Youngkin used on education and what Terry McAuliffe said about the role of parents in education that we found to be very effective when we talked to voters.
Youngkin clearly zeroed in on local politics, but do we know how much national politics influenced this election?
You know, anecdotally, we didn't hear a lot of Republican voters saying this is the referendum vote on Biden. It was mostly local issues. It was mostly this education issue, the issue of the critical race theory and Republican parents being very upset about what's going on at schools. But at the same time, if you look at Biden's disapproval ratings in this state, it's about 54%. So there's no way that that was helping Terry McAuliffe. So what we saw here really was all of these issues, all of this confluence of voters, Republicans coming home, the moderate women maybe not being as angry and marching to the polls to cast their referendum vote against President Trump. And all of these things kind of playing a big role. And just finally, you know, there's history. Terry McAuliffe was really going against the grain here, thinking that he could win a second term. There's only been, no governor has done that since 1851 here. We have term limits of 4 years. So he would have really broken a historical record there if he had pulled this out, guys.
A lot of things at play in this election. Heidi, thanks so much.
to New Jersey now, where votes are still being counted, and we wait for a winner to be declared in that state's governor's race. Here's where things stand right now. Democratic incumbent Governor Phil Murphy is fighting to keep the office. Take a look at that number, bottom of your screen right in the middle. That's the margin between these two. Look at how close that is. Former State Assembly member Jack Ciattarelli, who you see there on the left of your screen, has surpassed expectations in another state that President Biden won handily last year. This morning, as you can see, this race is still too close to call. NBC News correspondent Rahima Ellis is in Hoboken, New Jersey. Rahima, good morning. So let's start right there where this stands. Too close to call a winner. Vote is still coming in and still being counted. We see how small that margin is. How are things looking right now?
Well, it's, as you point out, this is a nail biter here in New Jersey. And one of the things that people are looking at is how these candidates were coming to the voters. We talked to a voter, a man who was on his way to work, and he said he voted for Murphy, but he thought Ciattarelli ran a better campaign. People were talking about that they saw more signs for him. So he was making his presence known here in this second attempt for him to win the seat of the governor's office here in this state. And he was also running in favor of a lot of people who have expressed enormous frustration with the economy and with the high taxes. You know, the taxes, property taxes here in New Jersey are the highest of any state in the country. In addition, while COVID was an issue for 20 months, it's not the biggest issue that people are thinking about. As I say, it's the economy. And some people are also mad about the fact that the vaccine and the mandates were something that Governor Murphy was insisting on. There are a lot of people who were just frustrated and angry with that. And Ciattarelli was in their corner saying if he becomes governor, he's going to turn the tide away from that. That resonated with people. And as you can see, it's showing up in the polls right now, Savannah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk through each of these candidates' messages, each of their campaigns. So we'll start, Rahima, with Jack Ciattarelli. He did much better than the polls projected. And again, I mean, this was a state that President Biden won handily just a year ago. He has not declared victory, though. What was his closing message to voters? What did he campaign on?
One of the things that he was doing is saying that he is going to represent people here in the state of New Jersey. It is a common message you'll hear from politicians, but he was talking even last night as he addressed his supporters, saying he never called in outside celebrities or big political names to campaign for him. He was doing it by going door to door, diner to diner, facing the voters themselves and talking about what he would do with them. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, he was also listening to what the frustration and anger is. People know Christmas is coming. Hanukkah is coming. They're not happy that their Christmas presents are on some ship on a tanker out in the ocean. And he seemed to be listening to that intently. Savannah?
And now let's talk about the other side of this. If current Governor Murphy does pull this one out and wins re-election, first of all, I mean, he'd become the first Democratic incumbent to win re-election since 1977. Tell us about his campaign and where did it seem to work in the state?
Well, one of the things that he was doing is he was saying, if you like the way things have been going in the state in terms of COVID with education, don't change. Don't change course. Don't take a detour. Stick with Murphy. And for some people, it seemed to work. Many people thought that it would work overwhelmingly because there are more than 1 million more registered Democrats in the state than there are registered Republicans. And maybe some people felt comfortable that they did not need to go to the polls. The word is that the turnout here was lighter than some people would have liked it. And it's to his detriment. When Murphy ran in 2017, he got 300,000 more votes. Didn't get that this time. Savannah?
Rahima, lots to watch for there. We will stay on it throughout the morning, especially with that slim margin. Thank you so much.
Let's bring in NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray. So, Mark, big picture, what are the conclusions we can draw from these races as we look ahead to the midterms? And did Glenn Youngkin just give Republicans a 2022 playbook?
Yeah, Joe, it sure looks like it. And again, you know, one of the tactics and strategy that we ended up seeing Terry McAuliffe try to do was campaign on Donald Trump and really tie Republican Glenn Youngkin to Donald Trump. And when you end up looking at the exit poll, Donald Trump remains unpopular in Virginia. Just 42% end up having a favorable view of him versus 54% unfavorable. That's really similar to the vote margin we ended up seeing in the 2020 presidential race. race. So Donald Trump is still unpopular. But when we also look at some of the other exit polls, we ended up seeing that 17% of voters who ended up having an unfavorable opinion of Donald Trump voted for Glenn Youngkin. And so that, along with Glenn Youngkin's performance with independent voters, just a Trump message was not good enough for the Democrats and for Terry McAuliffe.
So, Mark, let's dig in on that. I mean, if that is the case there, that exit polls show this majority of Virginia voters disapproving of President Trump, but then the state still flips red in this governor's race, what does it say about his influence now? Also, what does it say about McAuliffe election strategy to make this another referendum on the former president, despite the fact that we did not see his opponent campaign with him much? At all,
yeah,
really.
Savannah, I think that this was more a referendum on Joe Biden and Democrats than Donald Trump. And of course, this is in a lot of ways kind of an inverse of what we ended up seeing in the 2017 races for New Jersey governor and Virginia governor, where an unpopular Donald Trump ended up dragging down his party and leading to big movement and gains for Democrats in Virginia, that they won by 9 points in 2017 and by 14 points in New Jersey. And so all of a sudden you end up having a Joe Biden who is unpopular, according to the exit poll we saw in Virginia. Just 45% of voters approved of the current president's job. And it really does look like the overall environment right now that has been unfavorable to Democrats turned out to be really decisive in both of these contests.
Mark, Virginia has been more of a purple state, especially when it comes to governors, known to go back and forth between red and blue, depending on which party wins the White House. What does this projected Republican victory tell us about voter attitudes right now when it comes nationally to Democrats having control in Washington and when it comes to President Biden?
Yeah, and so, Joe, what we're actually seeing is there are two big storylines in Virginia, and as in New Jersey, as we continue to count the votes, and that is, number one, in Virginia, you end up having a situation where the Republican base really just was turned out. That Glenn Youngkin did super well in rural areas, and for Terry McAuliffe was unable to really bring out a lot of African American voters. And so supercharged Republican turnout, less than enthusiastic or less than presidential level turnout for Democrats. And you have a situation where Virginia and New Jersey continue to look like they've always played that year after a presidential election, where they become much more difficult for the party in control of the White House.
Enthusiasm is key. All right, Mark, thanks so much.
Well, of course, stay on the latest election results throughout the morning, but we do want to move on to other major news this morning. More than 28 million children are now eligible to get the coronavirus vaccine. Overnight, CDC Director Rochelle Walensky signed off on the Pfizer vaccine for kids 5 to 11 years old, just hours after a CDC panel recommended the 2-dose vaccine. Doses of the kids' vaccine have already arrived at hospitals and pharmacies across the country, with more on the way. Pfizer is now speeding up distribution, saying they will have 11 million doses out the door over the next 10 days. Several of those doses are actually already at Children's National Hospital in D.C. That's where we find NBC News correspondent Cal Perry. Cal, good morning. Thanks for being up early for us. So in just a moment, I'll ask you about what's happening with these shots there where you are. But first, let's talk about the CDC's decision. What do parents waking up this morning need to know about the children's dose of this vaccine?
Yeah, certainly millions of parents have been waiting for this news. The morning is now. A lot of these kids are going to be seeing some jabs in the arms this morning. Just to run over some of the data for you, we can put up some of this, some of the information, some of the stats. 91% effective in preventing COVID. This was in the trial data amongst children ages 5 to 11. Side effects including fatigue, headache, and chills. Though when you look at the data itself, Savannah, the wide majority only saw sore arms. That was sort of the major side effect. Pediatric shot is about a third of the adult dose. That's 10 micrograms, not the usual 30 micrograms that both teenagers and adults are receiving. And the data showed no cases of myocarditis. That is swelling in the heart. That is what people were worried about. That is not happening in children, certainly not in the data that we've seen. And that, as you said, brings now 28 million children into play who can get the vaccine as of this morning. It is the hope, of course, amongst medical officials that this will really stem the tide of those infections, not only in schools, but as well as community spread, especially as we approach the holidays, Savannah.
Now, Cal, let's talk about how this rollout works. So despite Pfizer shipping out millions of doses already, as I mentioned, there are some at the hospital right behind you. The White House does say, though, the vaccine rollout for kids may not be fully up and running until next week. Why is that? And then what will that look like?
Look, part of that is going to be the dosage, right? As a third of the normal dose, 10 micrograms, that has to be measured out. Then it has to be given out. We did see HHS working weeks ago with a lot of these hospitals, especially in rural parts of the country, to get that vaccine out there. The other options are going to be, as they have been for teenagers and for adults, pharmacies, but of course, the pediatrician. Pediatrician's office is where a lot of medical officials are sort of pointing families towards in the next coming weeks, sort of when people are looking to get that vaccine.
And Cal, quickly there at Children's National, what's this rollout going to look like? I understand it's starting with more vulnerable children first this morning.
Exactly. It's the most acute patients that will be started with first, as we saw with adults as well. Immunocompromised children will be getting it here this morning, which, of course, is good news and a relief to a lot of families, Savannah.
Cal Perry, big news this morning. Thank you so much.
For more on this, let's bring in Dr. Ebony Jade Hilton. She's the co-founder and medical director of Good Stock Consulting and a professor of anesthesiology and critical care medicine. So, Dr. Hilton, we know adults, older adults, have been impacted by the virus more than children. So how do you explain to hesitant parents that it is important to get their kids vaccinated?
Right. You know, it is one of those things where, yes, adults tend to have worse outcomes, but we can't ignore the impact that COVID has had on our children. In fact, in September, it was the sixth leading cause of death for school-age kids, the sixth leading cause. And it's one of those things where vaccines can help to prevent that. We just now stated that it was 91% effective against infections, and it's 95% effective against symptomatic COVID, that severe COVID that lands kids in the hospital. So you have to weigh the risk of the fact that COVID is still here, the fact that we're still burying one person every 55 seconds in America, and that we're going to go to colder weather where kids are going to be indoors and it risks exposure to them. So vaccination is a way to protect.
So, doctor, as kids start getting this shot, remind us, what are the vaccine side effects that parents and kids should be watching out for?
Right. And it's similar. It's a sore arm. It is that when we have these side effects, we call them side effects, but actually it is your immune system working. So what do you see? It's just like when you go to the gym and work out those muscles, right? You start to sweat, you start to get, muscle aches. When we work out your immune system by giving you this vaccine, what causes are the side effects are the fevers. You may have fevers for a day or two. You may have muscle aches for a day or two. That is the way your body is showing you that, yes, my lymph nodes, my white blood cells, my body is starting to learn how to fight against COVID-19 should my child actually be infected while they're simply going to school. And we know those outbreaks are happening.
All right. I know kids are just starting to maybe get shots now, but let's talk about boosters anyway. We know adults are already getting Pfizer boosters. Do you think children might need a third dose or another dose down the line, or is it just too early to really know?
Well, it's too early to know, but I can only assume that that's going to be the case, right? We know that there is not we have one single vaccine that gets one dose. That's yellow fever. All other vaccines are either 2 or 3 dose series, and we know that. Sometimes 4 doses until you reach that true value of immunity. So we can anticipate, I would assume, that kids are going to follow along the same path that we are seeing with adults. But the great thing is when we are vaccinated, what we see is that we have a slowing of this virus attempt to infect the entire population. And I think one state that can show that is looking at Florida. We now hear these reports of, Florida has the lowest COVID rate. Yeah, because of the fact that now they're 60% vaccinated. That's the power and the influence of what vaccines can do.
All right. Dr. Ebony Jade Hilton, always good to have you on. Thank you so much.
President Biden is back in Washington this morning after attending that UN climate conference in Scotland. The COP26 meeting continues until next Friday, with world leaders working to deliver major action to curb climate change. Now, Biden promised major action, but back at home, his economic agenda, including climate change spending, is still facing pushback from some in his own party. Of course, we also have election results to get reaction on here. Joining us now is NBCNews.com senior White House reporter Shannon Pettype. She's going to walk us through all this. Shannon, good morning. So let's start with COP26. Before returning to Washington, the president announced that 100 countries will adopt new environmental rules to slash methane emissions. Was he able to achieve everything he set out to get done in Scotland, and how was that announcement received?
Well, setting a big, ambitious goal like that and getting as you mentioned, 100 countries on the same page. That was one of the big goals, one of the big efforts of this. Of course, now the hard work begins of actually implementing those policies, putting them into action, actually putting the money and investment into infrastructure and projects that will help reduce those emissions. So that's what comes next. I would note one other thing that the president really set out to achieve at this conference, though, was to establish the role of the U.S. as a leader back in the global community, particularly when it comes to climate change. And that was something the president said he felt he was able to accomplish. And he really tried to leverage the fact that China and Russia weren't at this meeting and that the U.S. instead was really the only global leader here that was working with other countries to tackle these big issues.
Now, Shannon, as the president is making these promises, a major spending bill that includes funding to fight climate change, one that he hoped to have buttoned up before making this trip overseas, still hangs in the balance. How likely is it that Biden can turn these promises into action?
Yeah, I mean, he comes back to Washington with a lot of work to do, and really we're in not much of a different place than he was when he left. Here's what the president had to say yesterday about whether he's optimistic he can get one of those key senators we need, that the Democrats need to get on board, Senator Joe Manchin. Here's what he had to say.
I understand that Joe is looking for the precise detail to make sure nothing got slipped in terms of the way in which the legislation got written that is different than he acknowledged he would agree to. But I think we'll get this done.
And the president is back in Washington today. He does not have anything on his public schedule, got in really late last night, but White House officials have indicated they plan to jump right back into those talks and continue to push to try and get a deal done here.
Shannon, before we let you go, we, of course, have to ask you about these election results that we're getting last night and this morning. How has the White House reacted to these results, especially these wins from Republicans?
Well, we haven't gotten a chance to hear directly from the president on that. Certainly, there was a lot of optimism that Democrats would be able to pull this off. Here's what the president had to say yesterday.
I've not seen any evidence that whether or not I am doing well or poorly, whether or not I've got my agenda passed or not, is going to have any real impact on winning or losing. Even if we had passed my agenda, I wouldn't claim we won because Biden's agenda passed.
But, a lot of White House officials do think, and Democratic strategists do think, that having that big, ambitious spending plan passed would have helped, would have given the gubernatorial candidate something to run on. And they're certainly hoping that by 2022, they've got something passed. So all those Democrats in the House who are up for re-election will have something to run on there.
All right, Shannon Pettypiece, thank you so much.
The Atlanta Braves are waking up this morning, assuming they slept, as World Series champions for the first time in more than 25 years. The Braves defeated the Houston Astros 7-0 last night in Game 6 of the Fall Classic, winning the series, of course, 4-2. It's their first World Series title since 1995 and their second since moving to Atlanta from Milwaukee in 1966. Braves slugger Jorge Soler was named World Series MVP after smashing 3 home runs in the 6-game series.
All right, it is time now for a check on your Morning News Now weather.
Michelle Grossman is in for Bill Cairns. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning, guys. So happy to be here. And I know you know this already because you made your way into 30 Rock, but it is cold outside. So many of us seeing below freezing temperatures. So freeze alerts all up along the Northeast into the Tennessee Valley, also the Ohio Valley. Where you see that hot pink, that's your freeze warning. And we're looking at 48 million people impacted. So here are some of the temperatures, 42 degrees in Newark. I think we'll drop a little bit more before we officially see that low for the day. Washington, D.C., 38 degrees. But look to the west. We're looking at Chicago below freezing, Detroit also below freezing, just 29 in Cincinnati. And here is the setup. So we have a jet stream that's so far down to the south that sort of opens the door for this cold air from Canada. We have an area of high pressure that's spinning that cold air in. And we're looking at temperatures 50 degrees in Dallas. So this cool air extends all the way to the south, even to parts of the southeast. And it's going to stay in place today, tomorrow, into Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So here are some temperatures for tomorrow. Roanoke, just 48 degrees. Indianapolis, 48 degrees. You definitely need those winter coats if you haven't pulled them out yet. And here's a look towards Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Just 53 degrees in New York. Keep in mind, about 61 degrees. That's average for this time of year. And we're also looking at some storms in the south. I just want to end with this because we're looking at the chance for some localized flooding in parts of southern Texas, southeastern Texas. And then this is all going to slide to the southeast. So Florida, you're going to get some rain tomorrow. Back to you guys.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.